everybody, welcome back to another movie review. Hope you guys have been enjoying the content of the channel as of late. Here for my second film of the week, because yesterday I went out to see a mystery movie, and that movie we just reviewed on the channel, that being Ordinary Angels, which is far from ordinary. And if you want to check out my visceral reaction, go check that out. It's a pretty long review. Apologies. I mean, when I talk, I talk. I will try to make this review short, but I make no promises because once I go, I just start going. But the film that I saw today was Bob Marley, One Love, which was written and directed by, forgive me if I am not getting his name correct, Ronaldo Marcus Green, I believe that's his name. Notable for some features in the past, specifically Monsters and Men, I believe, starring John David Washington. Most recently with King Richard, starring Will Smith, which was solid. I enjoyed King Richard. I haven't seen Monsters and Men, but I've heard that one is also decent. But King Richard was surprisingly good. Unfortunately forgotten because of the whole controversy that happened with Will Smith. But now taking up Bob Marley, detailing his journeys from escaping Jamaica after a very traumatic experience involving a shooting, throws him to London as he basically tries to escape from all of the political and just the physical elements that are taking shape in Jamaica. With all the shootings and all the political conversations that are taking place, he decides to run away from all of that and escape. Try to initially it seems to kind of like a detox, kind of just to relax sort of thing. But what then devolves into rather an escape, trying to run away and not face the trauma that is buried within his own self. And that seems to be what the film is ultimately trying to do in representing Bob Marley. Just to be frank up front, I don't know anything about Bob Marley. I'm not really familiar with him as a person. I don't look up this sort of stuff with singers and stuff like that. Just don't know anything about that sort of thing. But in essence, the film is trying to represent that of trauma and what it means to face our fears, ultimately reaching some level of peace within ourselves. And the word to describe the film, just to be blunt about it, is flat, because what you get in Bob Marley One Love is something that just feels rather disjointed in nature, because when we escape from Jamaica and we're in London for that extended period of time in America, it almost feels like there's a secondary film at play, and then the film remembers that there was an idea that a seed that was planted, and then it's like they planted two different seeds. They had one idea over here and they had one idea over here, and they took priority of that secondary idea and let that take shape more than a seed over here. Because the ideas of trauma, the ideas of someone wrestling with traumatic experiences, and a fear of returning to such grounds and finding some level of forgiveness and some peace within that idea seems pretty much in the background up until the end, where it becomes a forefront element. Because for the most part, it's just your typical, singer, your typical journey of the industry sort of thing. Gets wrapped up in the whole thing of fame and loses himself, and eventually finds some groundedness, or finds himself, gets on a certain level, is, able to wash himself away from all this fame and what have you. It plays really typical, but it also plays itself in a quite boring, if I have to be blunt. There were a lot of people in the theater on their phones, and I don't envy that, because the movie just feels very much so like a drag, because little really happens and very little also really matters, because as I said, it feels like the film is trying to juggle with two ideas at once, and it chooses to favor an idea that we really that's just, again, much more typical in design and typical in overall narrative. We've seen that story before constantly, and it's just the fault of also just, trying to do these kinds of stories in the first place, because, it's just typical industry stuff. I mean, so one person comes from one place and then they get wrapped up in the fame and want to have you, or completely different versions of themselves, and they eventually have a downfall period, realize to maintain their identity, their spirit, and that's their story. Like, it's the same sort of mechanics all the time. And the movie chooses to dive into that sort of personality versus doing the what initially was, and what the film ultimately tries to bill as the message of the entire film, as this idea of trauma and about how we deal with such things and facing our fears. It pretty much abandons that idea for a large chunk of its time, and then brings back up as if it was always there to begin with. So, um, so I found it a little snoozy, a bit boring, and just pretty underwhelming, pretty unremarkable. That's the word I'll say. Um, Also, with the performances, I would echo the same sentiments. I mean, they're fine. The guy who plays Bob Marley, I think he was also in One Night in Miami. He played Malcolm X, and I remember him being pretty good in that. The entire ensemble in One Night in Miami actually being pretty solid. Um, he's okay here. I think the wig is distracting. I just could not buy that being his actual hair for 1 second. Um, but Performance wise, it's fine. I actually think that the wife, Listen Lynch, forgive me if I butchered her name, but she was in one of the latest James Bond films. Um, she's she's actually not that bad. She's pretty capable in this. I think she's probably the strongest of the performances. Um, but I just felt pretty removed. That's the ultimate word for it. Like, pretty detached, pretty just like, I had a very careless feeling when watching it. I wasn't really involved with it, um, and a lot to do with just the optics, just how they choose to focus on the story. Like I said, they have two different types of stories it wants to play with, and it ultimately sides with one, and the one that it decides with, or that sides with, is rather stale, typical, predictable, boring, versus the more intriguing idea, which is something that actually embeds the character with more meat and more distinction, and plays more to the resonance that could be there. Um, so like, it ultimately just fell flat, and it's unfortunate, really, because I could see within the I could see within the performances and within um, the overall approach that it could have been actually something pretty solid, but where it ultimately moves, where it ultimately chooses to take its story, it just devolves rather than evolves. As time just goes on, you're just bored, and you just never find yourself really more interested. As time goes on, you're just more and more and more bored and more snoozy, and more phones came out when as the movie dragged on. Um, so I would say fairly disappointing, and pretty underwhelming, but more or less just pretty unremarkable. Um, so the redeeming element being the performances, but even those performances are fine at best. Um, and for a film in general, it's not bad, but it's pretty forgettable. I'm not really gonna remember much of it after I go home and do, just, after I do the editing and all the stuff. I'm just not gonna remember anything, except the fact that there was marijuana in the theater. I just kept smelling marijuana throughout. Not sure why that was permitted or that was fine. Don't know why, but yeah, I felt it to be just nothing that interesting, and it had it had it had the idea to, it had the potential to be interesting if they chose to do what they initially pitched as the film, but then they just decided to push that aside in favor of something else more typical in nature, and it's just boring. So yeah, so those are my thoughts on Bob Marley, One Love. Pretty unremarkable, and it could have done something more interesting if it chose to focus more on his trauma and more about his overall character, because there's a very apparent distance that is felt when watching the film, and it really shouldn't have been there. But it just kept growing, that over that distance. It starts off kind of in this little place right here, and as time goes on, instead of actually getting more and more acquainted, we just find ourselves just more and more distant, to the point where I just found myself at one point just not caring, and just kind of waiting for it to end. So yeah, so yeah, I wasn't really big on it, and based on the response in the theater, kind of a mixed bag. So you guys, what are your thoughts on Bob Marley, One Love? Did you guys like it? Did you guys not like it? The audiences seem to be enjoying it. Like, generally speaking, maybe it was just my theater, but just didn't really pop or really hit in my theater. But you guys know your thoughts on the film in the comment section below, and your thoughts on the filmmaker in general with his previous work. I liked King Richard, surprisingly, quite a bit. But let me know all your thoughts in the comment section below. And that's going to be it for me, guys. Thank you guys for tuning in. And until then, I will catch you guys in the next video.